admire your courage, Miss...
Trench. Sylvia Trench. I admire your luck, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
Junior?
Welcome back. This is part 2 of 3 of our look into the expanded universe of James Bond. That is, the official stories with protagonists who are not James Bond. Last week, we covered the 4 protagonists that Fleming himself created and wrote for, but with his death, the Bond universe moved into another phase. A phase which, oddly enough, started without Bond. That's right. The first ever Bond continuation novel had a different protagonist, and featured Bond even less than any previous one had, in that it didn't contain him at all. When you first hear of a teenage James Bond series, 3 concepts spring to mind. The first is, of course, just doing a series about James Bond as a teenager, which has now been done, albeit 13 years after the period covered today ended. The second alternative would be to do one about James Bond's son. This is less canon-breaking than you might think, because A, our boy JB gets around, and B, he actually had a son with Kissy Suzuki in the 1964 novel You Only Live Twice, who was then named as James in the 1973 authorised biography of 007, and then killed by Irma Bunt in the 1997 short story Blast from the Past. Even if you consider the 1973 and 1997 editions as canon, that still leaves a lot of room for manoeuvre, as the boy starts off on the other side of the world with an absent spy father who has made a few friends and a few enemies, and may or may not know he even exists. As I said, the first option was developed into a 9-novel book series between 2005 and 2017, while the second has been developed, well, not at all. So it is somewhat perplexing that the third, canon-breaking option of James Bond has a nephew has received not just 1, but 3 different incarnations in about that number of decades. The Adventures of James Bond Jr. 003½ came out in 1967, just 1 year after the last of the 2 posthumous Bond books by Ian Fleming. Like the Fleming books, it carried the Glidrose Productions copyright, and was first published in the United Kingdom by Jonathan Cape. It was credited to R.D. Mascot, which was actually the pseudonym of... well, for years no one was sure. Even after the writer was supposedly dead, his publishers wouldn't say, keeping the secret they had made him when he wrote the book. Many have suggested Roald Dahl and Kingsley Amis, the latter presumably because a year later he published Colonel Sun, the first continuation book to feature Bond as a lead character, also under a pseudonym, Robert Markham. Roald Dahl's case was far stronger. Firstly, there are some similarities to a children's book that he wouldn't publish for another 8 years, Danny the Champion of the World, which itself introduced ideas Dahl returned to 7 years later in the BFG. Secondly, Dahl had already worked on a Fleming-inspired project in 1953.
My friend, the late Ian Fleming, the James Bond man, was really responsible for the story you're going to see now.
And would again on 2 film adaptations of his friend's work, You Only Live Twice and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, the former the same year as James Bond Jr. and the latter a year later. However, Amis and Dahl's styles were far from a perfect match, and the mystery remained unsolved until the last few years when it was apparently confirmed by his family that the true author was novelist Arthur Calder Marshall.
Dun dun dun! Who?
Calder Marshall is less famous than Dahl or Amis, but his style is the closest and, thanks to investigators and his family, now has the most evidence to support it. His close but secret relationship to one of the most famous characters of the modern age was a part of an unfortunate pattern. He wrote a book which Orson Welles adapted into a film which never got made. He wrote multiple scripts for Bond custodian MGM which never got made. And he wrote a book which famous actor James Mason bought with a plan to make his directorial debut, and which was adapted by the guy who wrote the books Cabaret and A Single Man were based on, which never got made. Oh, and do you know the term gaslighting? Well, that comes from the word gaslight, which was his novel. Ization of a film based on a play called The Gaslight. But back then, a novelization was basically the closest thing most people had to home media after a film left the cinema, so seems worth pointing out. Calder Marshall also novelized Victim, the first English-language film to use the word homosexual. So he probably also ghostwrote the SJW agenda, and would have fitted right in with Ian Fleming, the man who ruined James Bond by making a woman into the lead of one book. The Adventures of James Bond Jr. 003.5 follows James Bond's nephew, Junior.
Junior?
On holiday, as he becomes convinced the new owner of Hazley Hall is involved in a recent robbery of a large quantity of gold. He tries to uncover the truth, first by getting close to Sheila Smith, the niece of one of the suspected robbers, and then by sneaking his way onto the property, sometimes with Sheila's help and sometimes without it. The book climaxes with a midnight journey through the property involving guard dogs, gunfire, injury, and an escape from trackers through water. But James's efforts partially go to waste. The information is given to the commander of the police, Sir Cuthbert Conningtower, while James is unconscious. Conningtower takes the credit for himself while the boy recuperates from his ordeal, and he later threatens James if he says anything. The book is pretty much a Secret 7/Famous 5 adventure, with some older Fleming Roald Dahl-esque cruelty thrown in. It's a world of boyhood gangs and adventures in the countryside stopping crime, but it's also a story in which a guard dog gets brutally and intentionally run over, another gets its leg ripped up in a man-trap and then gets an entire magazine emptied into it because the first bullet didn't kill it, and the actual credit of the collar goes to a rich local man who claims the child sleuthing as a way of covering up his affair with a young actress. The affair is heavily hinted at throughout the book, but never revealed to James, so one wonders what a child reader would make of the downbeat finale if he doesn't understand why Conningtower acted the way he did. As such, it seems fair to say that the book goes into much more mature territory than The Secret Seven or other books of that genre. One possible reason Calder Marshall used a pseudonym is that, as has also been suggested about Amos's pen name a year later, the publishers were looking to start a new series by different writers, all under the same name. If this was indeed the case, and as far as I know there is no evidence saying it was, said series didn't pan out for either work, though Amos's book Colonel's Son is commonly seen as one of, if not the, best of the post-Fleming Bond books. While Mascot's book hasn't had the same longevity, second-hand copies are always popping up on different websites in British, American, French and German editions, so the book must have been at least reasonably successful in its day. However, it quickly spawned the first and only Bond Universe TV show 24 years later, which, on the scale of The Big Bang to today, is so quick a cash-in it's honestly embarrassing. In those 24 years, there was very little action in terms of extended JB media, and none of it was unrelated to James Bond Jr., hence how the 1967 to 1992 era is his exclusively and by default. The closest we came to something else was in 1983 with the Battle of the Bonds, when all three Eon Bonds returned to the character in adaptations of work that were partly by Fleming and kept apart by legal trouble. There was Roger Moore in Octopussy, Sean Connery in Never Say Never Again, and George Lazenby in The Return of the Man from U.N.C.L.E., based on the TV show that Fleming had created characters for and worked on before Eon threatened legal action over the use of the name Solo and Fleming was forced to distance himself from the series. Because of rights issues, Lazenby wasn't technically playing Bond. Instead, he played a man with the initials JB who works on Her Majesty's Secret Service and drives an Aston Martin souped up with gadgets. So if you add 2 and 2 together, the more perceptive of you will reach 007.
Shaken, but not stirred.
So why mention it here? In 1983, this was indeed no more than a fun nod to the series that spawned the spy boom Uncle was born in, but today, when cinematic universes can be built out of a few name drops and cameos, this and Fleming's role in the creation of the series are enough in my view to make Napoleon Solo, Ilya Kuryakin, April Dancer, and Mark Slate worthy of note, if only in passing. Much more relevant though, and happening around the same time in the early 80s, James Bond Jr. was getting promoted, from 003.5 to 005. He had been reincarnated as a 10-year-old Indian superchild detective in a 16-installment comic, which I guess makes this forgotten comic the first appearance of a non-white protagonist in James Bond media, though it wouldn't be the last. The series doesn't seem to have had anything in common with either the books or the films, and definitely not with the previous incarnation of James Bond Jr., aside from the investigative angle, here with a very different tone and audience. Even the detective streak they share is doubtless a coincidence due to the genre's popularity with children. In fact, this entire comic was probably just a cash-in on the recognisable name, combining it with the then lucrative Indian markets of detective comics and children's ones. However, the attempt wasn't very successful, as the entire comic printing branch of this publishing company folded after less than a decade's existence. But when they did, a third version of JB Jr. was about to give the character his second run of comics, this time off the back of a TV show.
Bond. James Bond Jr. No one can stop him, but scum always tries. Young Bond cuts through each web of spies. He learned the game from his Uncle James. Now he's heir to the name James Bond. James Bond Jr. Look out, he's coming through. He's got a job to do while he rescues the girl. James Bond Jr. chases scum around the world.
Well, that about sums it up. James Bond Jr. is a student at Warfield Academy, a school for the children of rich and influential people, which somehow also include James Bond's nephew, Q's grandson, and Felix Leiter's son. In each episode, and most often with his friends, JB Jr. foils a plot almost always concocted by an agent of scum, a Spectre stand-in created by Eon due to the same legal problems which had led to the Battle of the Bonds a few years earlier. Most of these agents are characters from the films, some of which were drawn from the Fleming books, such as Goldfinger, Oddjob, Dr. No, Jaws, or Knick-Knack. All of them were redesigned for a 90s children's show, and to them were added more villains such as Dr. Derange, Barbella, Baron von Scarin, and Walker D. Plank. Now, a TV show or film around the James Bond Jr. premise had been discussed at multiple points since the 60s. In fact, the year before the original book came out, Bond producer Harry Saltzman announced a television series about a 10-year-old who fought Spectre. As such, though nothing came of that, it is perhaps fitting that when the TV series did finally happen in the 1990s, it was more of a new take on the idea of James Bond's nephew than an adaptation or sequel to the 1967 book or the 1980s Hindi comic. Many would probably say that all three should count as different characters, but if Roger Moore and Daniel Craig are playing the same Ian Fleming character, I really don't see why these can't be three different incarnations of the same thing too. The series ran from 1991 to 1992, during the interregnum between Timothy Dalton and Pierce Brosnan's respective runs on the character, making this modest children's cartoon show the only new screen adventure in the James Bond series between 1989 and 1995, and thus also the first ones of the 1990s, with the second half of the series airing after the fall of the USSR. Although this multimedia series is officially licensed, its place within the canon of anything is debatable. If the mascot book was presumably set in the Fleming book timeline, if only because of its format, publishers, and lack of filmic elements, the cartoon is in the film one due to the gadgets, sense of humour,
Why would anyone threaten you and your family, Shake Your Booty? Oil?
and the presence of film-only characters, like Knick-Knack and Jaws,
We'd better warn Dr. No.
Yeah.
even though it obviously contradicts the films with its use and combination of these characters. The writers of the show were explicitly told any version of Bond was out of bounds, to avoid issues of continuity with any future films. The basic premise of a nephew of James Bond goes against the films as it did the Fleming books, where Bond was an only child and an orphan, at least until Spectre gave him a kind of semi-half-brother. So I suppose James Bond Jr. paved the way for this particular retcon. Or the implication is that Blofeld had a crime-fighting son who took his father's nemesis's name, which sounds like a TV show coming soon to Amazon Prime. Especially when you then add in Bond's 60s brother and his 80s Indian sister or sister-in-law. For an only child, Bond sure is a liar. The American roots of the show are pretty noticeable, From the over-enunciated English accents to the awful Scottish ones, from the apparently routine presence of naval frigates on Loch Ness to the misunderstanding of European laws on drinking and gambling, 18, not 21, which, when they state Bond is 4 years too young, make him 14 rather than the intended 17. Which is particularly unfortunate when one takes into account the number of times he goes on dates with women who have jobs, PhDs, and other signs of being well over school age. The TV show's formula deviates by necessity from the films they are based on. The episodes are 22 minutes long, made to a tight budget, and have to be entirely child-friendly. However, it does create a rather unique identity. The need to create 65 different stories that can presumably be played in almost any order means that, amidst the more typical globe-trotting fare of evil organizations trying to make money or take over the world, we get everything from Indiana Jones-type adventures in Pompeii, Rome or El Dorado, to a Frankenstein story with a Scooby-Doo-style werewolf, a Lovecraft/John Carpenter story involving ice, tentacles, eggs, and acid, and a pastiche of the Warwick Davis Leprechaun film, of all things. The show also goes pretty sci-fi at times, which, almost halfway between the laser gun space battles of Moonraker and the invisible car of Die Another Day, probably can't be considered a break from tradition. What definitely can, however, are the existence of the Fountain of Youth, telekinesis, shape-shifting, Aladdin's lamp, and Thor's hammer. And their inclusion is somewhat puzzling, since other appearances by the Mummy, the Loch Ness Monster, possessed dolls, kaiju, UFOs, tentacled monsters in the Arctic ice, leprechauns, vampires, werewolves, etc., are all given a, quote, scientific explanation, albeit a firmly sci-fi one. In total, the TV show ran for 65 episodes, which was apparently a usual length for a show wanting to be syndicated. It was also long enough to accidentally stumble across plots from more canonical versions of Bond. One episode involved the protagonist taking the place of a racer in order to beat up a souped-up car driven by someone whose plans involves getting rid of the competition, a story which, it later turned out, Fleming had come up with for his aborted TV series but never used, though it later turned up in Anthony Horowitz's Trigger Mortis in 2015. Another episode involved a villain trying to get his hands on an arid country's water supply for profit.
My country, alkaline, has a resource more precious than oil.
In the desert, the only thing more precious than oil would be water.
A certain organization wishes to sell my water at extremely high prices.
This is the world's most precious resource. We need to control as much of it as we can.
Making Quantum of Solace a closer adaptation of this show than the story it's named after. 10 of the episodes were novelized, 6 by John Peel under the pseudonym John Vincent, and 4 by Karen Jenner. Between those and the original Mascot book, that means the number of JB Jr.-centric novels actually ties with the number of James Bond-centric ones written under Ian Fleming, at 11 each. It also means there have been more James Bond Jr. novelizations than James Bond Sr. ones, as the latter has been stuck at the thoroughly appropriate number of 7 since 2002. But whereas the TV show is remembered fondly by many millennials, the novelizations they spawned were either unsuccessful at the time or quickly forgotten. If the current second-hand market is anything to go by, only 2 of them, A View to a Thrill and Live and Let's Dance, seem to have circulated enough to still be around now, and as they were the first and third published, it seems to suggest an early drop-off. Or, maybe it means that they are so well loved that millions of people treasure them to this day and have never considered selling them on. Whatever the case is, I've only been able to read the first one, which is mostly notable for being the only appearance in the series by James Bond, as Vincent got around the embargo by opening the book with an exchange of telegrams between Bond and M. So he doesn't physically appear, but he does get a very short conversation, albeit in text. As to the book's literary qualities, well, R.D. Mascot was definitely the high point of this mini-franchise, as this is on roughly the same level as a Goosebumps book, which shouldn't really come as a surprise to anyone, but for some might place it above several of the adult Bond continuation books in terms of quality. Either way, they're not an essential addition to the episodes they are retelling, a drawback they share with most of the other JB Jr. media. With the exception of 7 of the 12 issues of a Marvel comic, all 90s iteration of James Bond Jr. are adaptations of the TV show, including 2 seemingly unpopular forays into the world of video games. These are perhaps only notable as they share their medium with the only other entirely non-Fleming related Bond protagonist, who would herald the start of the 3rd phase of their universe. But that is a story for another time. Overall, James Bond Jr. is probably the biggest forgotten facet of the James Bond series. The TV show, which is currently available for free on YouTube in glorious VHS transfer, is probably the hardest to recommend, as the variety I praise is a symptom of its size, and you can't really enjoy how weird it gets if you don't really know how pedestrian a children's show it can be. However, I was surprised by how watchable it became, possibly in a Stockholm Syndrome way, and positively delighted when the children's James Bond series did an entire H.P. Lovecraft / John Carpenter style story. The first and original book by R.D. Mascott is, however, the best part of this series for me. In fact, it easily makes the top 10 best Bond continuation books of all time, probably narrowly missing out the top 5. Obviously though, this comes with the caveat that this is a children's book, and like pretty much everything else discussed in this expanded universe, probably isn't for the casual fan of the Bond films. There would be 10 years between James Bond Jr.'s last appearance and the next officially sanctioned non-Bond characters, and this, the 3rd and final phase of our narrative, would not be the creation of a single author or the different incarnations of a single character, but a plethora of characters written by different people for different timelines, settings and mediums. So, join us next time for our first disabled protagonist, several black ones, an original villain, and a multiverse of moneypennies. If that interests you, please subscribe and smash the bell. Until then, I will leave you in the slow-moving, intricate trap of your own existence. Goodbye.